Shalom and welcome to another edition of our Daily Bread. I'm Messianic Torah, and this week's Parashat is the 8th Parashat of the book of Bereshit, also called Genesis, and it's called Vayishlach, which means, and he sent. And this Parashat starts in Genesis or Bereshit 32:4 through 36:43, with the half-Torah in Hosea or Hosea 11:7 through 12:12. And my message for 2014-15 is called Spirit versus the Flesh. And my message this year, as we start off this parasha, one of the things that we see here is, of course, we've got the story of Esav and Yaakov. Yaakov returning to Esav. Some people call that Esav's time of trouble. And this is, this reunion, this serious reunion where he's going to have to face his brother, who last time they had talked was wanting to kill him. And so he left, all this time has passed by, but, that was the last thing left in his mind. And so he's going to come back and he's afraid. And we go through all of that, and then we get into the story of Dinah and Shechem raping Dinah, and then that whole situation. And then we end up with the last kind of part, the journeys of Yaakov, and then the death of Rachel, giving birth to Benjamin, and also mention of Yitzhak's death as well. So we've got two major people who die in this parasha. And then we get into the half-Torah, where it goes into Ephraim and Yehuda doing wickedness, but he's going to bring them back, and they're going to serve him. So my message is called Spirit and Flesh. And this really starts off with the concept of this battle. What is this? When you look at this story, when you look at Yaakov, when you look at the comparisons that we got about Esav, when they were born even, it talked about Yaakov being a man that dwelt in tents, and Esav was a man of the field. So if you watch my other messages on the previous parashas, you're going to see we talk about that. I think we talk about that in Vayetze. I think it goes into the end of Tolda, though, possibly. So anyway, you get this difference between this contrast between this outside and this inside. And this is an important model for us to learn and to think about, because Mashiach teaches about this when we get in the New Testament repeatedly, over and over again. And it's also a message that we get all throughout the Scriptures. And it's very important to dial into. And this parashat really illustrates it. So we have Yaakov, who represents this spiritual man, this inside man. He's a man, an inside man. And Esav is an outside, or an outward, an earthly man. And so when we look at this, and we look at this story, and we see the patterns and the models that these stories teach us, it gives us additional understanding. Yaakov is going to send a servant to tell Esav he's returning. Now, why not just return? He could have returned, but a couple things. Number one, if he returned, maybe Esav's very angry, and then that's brought all back up and refreshed. And in the heat of the moment, right? Remember, Esav is a heat of the moment kind of guy, just like selling his birthright because he was hungry. This is the earthly man. The earthly man is not the man who thinks first and acts second. He's the person who has emotion first and is driven by desire and emotion. And we're going to see how that plays out in this week's parasha. So he gets a warning. So in a sense, by the servant coming, Yaakov is forcing him to be more like Yaakov and to be more of a spiritual man, more of a person who he can get angry and flip out and do whatever he wants when he hears, but then some time is going to come past, and then he's going to see Yaakov. And so you're going to see this pattern all the way throughout what Yaakov does. He actually is continually putting Esav out of his element in that sense, and out of the element of being very reactionary or hot-headed and earthly and doing all of this. And I think this, right off the bat, before we even get into anything, teaches us that that's not a good way to be. and it's generally not a spiritual way to be, because even the Torah is essentially this servant that's coming out before you make a judgment, right? Is first we go to the Torah, right? And we look at the message, or the messenger gives us the Torah, gives us a message. And we're supposed to, before we make that decision, we're not just going to make a brash decision. We're going to first look at the Torah and say, well, what does the Torah tell? And we're going to think about it. And there's going to be a bit of separation between thought and ultimate decision, And this is what living the Torah lifestyle means. It means before we eat, we think, well, is that kosher? Is that something I should eat? Before we speak, before we do something, is that lawful? This is what we're trying to become. And we really start off, even with the model of Esau, the firstborn, more fleshly like. Most people, when they come, and even after they've come to Torah, they're still making quick decisions. They're making decisions without including God in His judgment. And so they're very much more kind of that earthly hunter, going by just emotion and instinct, and very primal, instead of being thoughtful and thinking first to have right judgment. As the Torah teaches us, the judge will diligently search out a matter and then make his decision. So we get back to the signs of the Spirit. So what does this mean? Well, Yaakov's sending the servant. Why is he sending the servant? Well, I think it also represents that there's going to be signs of the Spirit. If we look at it from Esau's perspective, who is the world, the world is going to see signs of the Spirit when a person starts to become spiritual, right? And a couple of the key ones that they're going to see is judgment, right? Because before, people didn't have judgment. Before you came to Torah, you were just doing any old thing, eating any old thing, doing all this. So the world sees us as, they're seeing those initial signs of the Spirit. It's like that servant who goes to Esau first, because they start to see, friends and family and all those people start to see, hey, things are a little bit different. What's going on here? This person that I used to know who just, did whatever is now got some judgment in matters. They're making judgment calls. They're deciding whether or not they should or shouldn't eat something. They're deciding whether or not they should work on a certain day or do a certain something on the Sabbath versus other days. They're starting to have judgment in all these different things that they're doing. And that's one of the signs of the Spirit that earthly people will see. Hey, that's a spiritual person. Next, they'll see another sign of the Spirit is that they'll see discernment. And they'll see that you're starting to discern between different situations and different things. You're going to take that judgment and you're going to use discernment, and you're going to start dividing out things and go, I don't know if that's for me. You're going to start looking at your own life and saying, oh, wow, we got rid of a whole bunch of stuff when we came to Torah. And I think that that's, again, those initial signs of you starting to make that change. Is all of a sudden you start to think about things and what you're doing, and then you start to have discernment. You look at the things that you have and you go, oh, is this honoring God? Should I have that? Should I get rid of that? And then there's the separation, which is kind of the third sign of the Spirit, which is that you're going to separate things from you that you don't want to any more be associated with. You're also going to separate from probably friends and family in a way that isn't necessarily driven by you, but hey, they can't come over and, your boss can no longer say, hey, will you work for me on Saturday? Because you've now separated that time for God. And in that same way, you've separated yourself from every other coworker, and you've separated yourself from the boss. And they're going to see these initial messages. That's that servant coming to tell Esau. The world, the earthly men will see a sign of what's to come in these spiritual people. And they're going to start to see these little hints. And usually that transition happens. And that's where everyone has stories of, how their family treated them when they started keeping Torah, how they almost lost their job, how, they stopped going out to restaurants, and all these different things, that they did. And those are great testimonies and stories. And really those are just a telling of the story of the signs of the Spirit, which is telling you you're probably on the right track. Even with now being holiday times, you'll see signs of the Spirit in that people are having judgment. And they say, oh, I'm not going to do Christmas anymore, or I'm not going to do Easter. And those have pagan origins and questionable origins, and where did all these things come from, and where did they start? And people are trying to say that they're, oh, but we're doing it for religious purposes, so it's okay if some of the stuff is made up, or if it has pagan origins, or if it's not true. You know, that whole mindset of thinking about how Christmas works, many Messianics, you'll see in other videos that I do, I personally don't do celebrate Hanukkah, but it's that same time of year wrapped in with Christmas, and there's a lot of reasons why I don't, and you know, to me it makes no sense to jump out of the frying pan into the pot, so to speak, because the same judgment that people have towards Christmas, why don't they apply that towards Hanukkah? Because essentially it creates the exact same patterns. Its origins are, you know, elements of it that are, you know, the miracle of the oil, that's not even in the Maccabee account. That is supposed to be the reason that people are prompted to even keep this day. It's something that's a tradition that was added by rabbis later. Well, that's a miracle. Can you really just make up a miracle? And isn't that a lie? And at what point is that any different than Catholics or people who are, you know, who see Jesus in a piece of toast or a statue, a tear comes out of the statue and they're worshiping the tear, and it's like but it's a lie. We're not supposed to. It says He hates people who love a lie, and so that's just not true. And when you're talking about a miracle, the reason why that's relevant is because if it's a miracle, then you're essentially claiming that came from God, which is funny. It's a double entendre. It has a double meaning. It's a parable in itself, because the holy day itself is not from Leviticus 23. Those, it says, these are my feasts. That's what came from God. That's what came from the Torah. And many Messianics will say, oh, we know it's not commanded. But by saying we know it's not commanded, they're missing the key point, which is it didn't come from God. It came from men. Men decided to observe this thing. So there's holy days. A day that's holy to me is, if I'm talking in the relevance of biblical days, those are Leviticus 23. These are my feasts. Okay? No matter how a person tries to justify it, Hanukkah isn't listed in there. God didn't tell me to keep Hanukkah. Okay? So I don't. And then when we start talking about the miracle of, the supposed miracle of the oil, which doesn't take much searching to figure out when that got added and who added it and why, that it's not even authentic to the non-biblical story behind the whole Maccabee thing. And so it's twice removed. But when you call it a miracle, then you're saying God did that. Well, if you made it up, see, you can't lie about a miracle, because you're actually taking God's name in vain. You're taking His authority and applying it to something, and you're also bearing false witness against God by saying God did X, Y, Z. Well, if He didn't do that, then you're lying about God. And you're claiming something in God's name. That's no different than, actually, if you look at the Torah, that's no different than a false prophet. A false prophet says, God says, you know, this is going to happen. Well, when it doesn't and it's a lie, that prophet's put to death. So if you're going to go around talking about a miracle of oil that isn't written of in the Bible, and it's not written of in the Maccabees either, okay? It's made up by men, but you're saying God did that miracle, and then you're spreading it and teaching it to your children. How is that any different than people teaching their children about Christmas, which is a lie? It isn't Jesus' birthday, okay? And it's not founded on a religious concept. And then people say, oh, well, I'm not worshiping the Nimrod tree. Oh, well, I'm just, I do it, it's a great time to think about God. And, like they think that it's going to glorify God. But what glorifies God is, these are my feasts, right? Leviticus 23. You want to glorify God, Do it right there in Leviticus 23. Because the same people who run out and get a Hanukkah and get presents and do all the stuff associated with that and make this big hoopla and their kids are all excited about it. Well, how much effort did they put in to Sukkah or to Sukkot? Most of those people who celebrate Hanukkah, they don't actually build a Sukkah. And even the ones that do, very few of them actually sleep out in the Sukkah and go and live out in the Sukkah. Some build a ceremonial thing in their front yard and go out in it a couple times and go back into their homes. So how can you neglect God's holy days and then put so much effort and excitement into these other days that are made up by men based on lies and mimicking? Do your search and do a study on it. They adopted presence and all of that. It's there for you to examine and to research when and why they did that. They did it to be, so that the Jewish kids wouldn't feel left out at Christmas. So how is that not giving the Jewish kids a Christmas by adding all the gifts? Right? It's not even something that was original to a non-original, non-biblical day. You can see when in history that started happening, when that added. And yet, again, people go, it's all about Torah. No, it isn't. It's not all about Torah at all. And if you're interested in the dedication, hey, why aren't you celebrating the actual dedication of that temple? That was the rededication, actually. Where's your holy day if you're really concerned about the dedications of the temple and how important that is? Why don't you recognize when the same temple was originally dedicated? Why aren't you making a day out of that? Why aren't you making a day out of the other days the other temples were dedicated? If that's the key. But people say one thing, but it's about this, and that's why we're doing it. Inconsistent, incongruent. So I challenge people, because this goes back to this concept of the signs of the Spirit, is judgment. Oh yeah, and I'll be unpopular. Just like the Christians who don't want you to take away their Christmas. Messianics don't want you to take away their Hanukkah. But at the end of the day, I'm sorry if that offends. I can only say what I see and what I choose for myself. Everybody else is going to choose what they want for themselves. And hey, good for you. You already do what you want, and you're going to continue to do what you want. But if you care to do a little due diligence and observe and be careful with what you're doing, judgment, discernment, separation from things that don't. This parashat, that's what this whole thing is going to be about. Okay? These are the patterns. These are the repeating patterns. And so we have to apply them to ourselves, because it's so easy to go, oh, look at those silly Christians over there. Look at what they're doing. I can't believe they're doing that. They don't even realize why they're putting a present under a tree. And they're saying it's Jesus' birthday, but did anyone look it up and see if that's true? And at what point, when you tell them that that's not likely to be the time when Yahushua or Jesus was born, most of them then still just don't care and do it anyway. And it's just the same way when you say, oh, well, the miracle of the oil, the supposed miracle of the oil, didn't really happen, even the original account, and people say, oh, I don't care, and they'll go back and they'll still be calling it, oh, it's Festival of Light, look at it's about the great miracle. And it's like, so after you're aware of something or someone's challenged you on something, you just don't care, because ultimately you didn't care. You weren't doing that because of good judgment that you made. You were doing it for other reasons. And so those other reasons trump your judgment, and you no longer care to look up the origins of Hanukkah or the story or the oil or any of that thing and look on the other side to see if there's something potentially wrong with it, or to notice the obvious exact patterns that the judgment you use against Christmas would mean that you couldn't celebrate Hanukkah either if you applied that same logic and judgment in those same ways. Because people want to, whether they like to have a Jewish Christmas or they just like it, or it's tasty. That's why Christians don't give up Christmas, because they like it too. Okay? But part of discernment, part of these signs of the Spirit, is all of a sudden you're going to start saying, hey, maybe you loved bacon before. But when you start to saying, I want to follow God, you have to reevaluate whether you should even have that lust or that like for bacon. Because at first you'll say, oh, I've seen people before, Messianics, and they'll say, oh, wow, oh, I miss, oh, yeah, I used to eat bacon all the time. Oh, I can't now. I mean, they're right at the gate. Oh, I'd love to, but I just can't. And it's like, why don't you back away from the fence and the line? Why don't you realize that if that's an abomination, your love should change, because God doesn't love bacon. Okay? So it's not something that you're just being restrained from doing, but you really want, right? That model is the man who looks after the woman with lust. Well, I'm not physically sleeping with her, but boy, man, I'm just right at the line. Boy, oof. I'll tell you what, I would, man, in a hot minute. I mean, technically, hey, I didn't. Yeah, I restrained myself. No. You want to have the commandments in your heart because you want to align yourself with God to the point where you're looking and going, there's nothing for me there. I don't want to lust after my flesh. I want to be a spiritual man or woman. So next we go to the next section in this week's Parashat, which is the battle between the spirit and flesh. So this is kind of like the battle between, now Yaakov had sent the messenger to tell him that he was coming. Okay? Those are the signs of the spirit. Next we're going to get, Yaakov was afraid of Esav and divided his camp into two bands, right? And he's praying for YHWH to deliver him. And what we see here is this is going to be, these two are not compatible. Esav and Yaakov. There's a war going on. And this is a battle. And that's the same internal battle that we all have between the spirit and the flesh. So your flesh wants to literally, like Esav said, kill you, right? For taking what? Its birthright? Because Esav wanted to satisfy himself with a momentary desire, his hunger, right? And a lot of sin comes from a temporary desire. Looking on the woman with lust, adultery comes from a temporary desire. I mean, even the natural model of sex itself actually illustrates that it's a temporary desire. Because even when you're satisfied, when that person goes up, whether it's your wife or whether it's somebody else's wife, obviously it shouldn't be, and you sleep with her, that only satisfies for a moment. And then in a moment, just like eating food, when you're hungry, it satisfies you, and you'll get hungry again. And then that feeling of satisfaction that you had, it's gone. Hour later, 2 hours later, you no longer have that feeling that you did. It's very fleeting. And yet, people will do that and to great harm for that moment's pleasure. And so that's what happens. Like Esav, when all these events happened, the reason why Yaakov got sent away says because Esav purposes to kill you, right? He's comforting himself, right, by saying he's going to kill you. So that's that same internal struggle, right? Like people probably imagine, well, I can't eat that ham sandwich anymore because now I'm following Torah. Or I'm not going out to a restaurant anymore because it's unlikely that it could be kosher even if I order something that's biblically categorized as clean, like a chicken sandwich or a cheese pizza. Okay, well look, cheese is kosher. That cheese is not kosher though. There's no way the guy who just grabbed all that pepperoni and has pepperoni grease on his hand, even if he has the gloves, guess what he's doing? He's grabbing a scoop of your cheese to make your just cheese pizza. It's going on the same pan, right? And it's touching all the same things. And when the guy goes for the Canadian bacon and he's got a scoop of that and it's dripping pork juice across the cheese, okay? I've worked in a pizza place before. I know exactly how it goes. And I can tell you right now, ordering a cheese pizza from a pizza place is in no way going to be kosher. Let alone the laws and rules about the ovens and the cutting knife that has all that pork grease when it just cut a pepperoni pizza, and people, oh, I'm going to ask them to wipe the blade. Really? Wiping the blade? You think that's clean? That they wiped it with a rag that's sitting in the bucket of water that's been wiping pork juice, all that pork juice is in the water that's now on the rag that's supposedly more smearing the pork defilement, and besides that thing is already defiled, right, at that point, even when you wipe it. And there's just 100 ways that's not going to be clean. And so when a person comes in and just out of ignorant bliss thinks, well, I'm Messianic, so I'll take the cheese pizza. No. You've defiled yourself. You've made yourself unclean. Okay? And your choice is not one of discernment or separation. Right? As it says, can you draw near to the fire and not be burned? Yeah. If you want to go where the main ingredient that they're selling in that whole place and what you're breathing in and everything, the smell of the oven, it's pepperoni and it's ham and sausage, and everybody in there is touching things that are unclean, and so everybody there is probably unclean, and the oven's unclean, and the knives are unclean, and the buckets and the barrels and all of this stuff, everything's defiled, and that's the place you want to go and eat, and you think that you're going to pull something clean out of there? Not even close. But see, then this goes into Esav, your fleshly side, then, right? But I'm hungry. You're telling me I can't go and order my cheese pizza anymore? How convenient was it to just pick one up over at this pizza place or that pizza place, or have it delivered or this and that? I'm going to enjoy my breadsticks and I'm going to do all that. Well, that's Esav saying, I don't want to hear it. In my heart, I want to win over Yaakov, right? The flesh wants to win over the spirit. The flesh wants to kill, and ultimately wants to kill Yaakov. And you know what? Esav ultimately will kill Yaakov if Esav has its way, because ultimately the two, as in the story, are one. The question is, who are you? Esav or Yaakov? Because most likely you're both, which is also illustrated with Yaakov, who puts on the garments of Esav. He's part Esav, part Yaakov. We're flesh and spirit. We have elements about us on both parts. The question is, who's going to rule over? Who's going to get the blessing? Esav or Yaakov? Is your spirit rule over your flesh, or do you let your flesh rule over your spirit? Because if your flesh has its will, it will kill the spirit. If you go, you know what? Oh, that's silly. I mean, I can order a cheese pizza, or I had them wipe the knife off and all this and that. Look, I've seen it before, and I've managed restaurants. I can tell you, guaranteed right now, you are not. If that is not a kosher certified restaurant, then you are not eating kosher. Everything's cross contamination, and it's just ridiculous. But if you want to believe it is, so that you can not have the guilt of having to make a righteous judgment, then you can go about it. And that's just Esav literally killing. The wages of sin is death. So Esav wants to kill Yaakov, because if you follow your desires, that will lead to death. And as you see that with Esav, it's not going to lead to blessing. Okay? It's not going to be representative of the birthright. You'll be this odd place with Esav, where you think you're spiritual and you think you're a follower of God, but you've chased after your momentary desires. You've sold your birthright for a bowl of porridge. You've gone into the field, into the world. You're a worldly, fleshly man, a man of blood, which chases after emotions and desires, and you'll have none of the blessings. That's just the reality. So everybody's facing this concept. This is the battle. It's also with religious people. See, it's so many people want to say, oh, everyone else, those guys, non-religious people, the bad guys, we're the good guys. Or, oh, the Christians and the Jews, well, they don't quite got it. The Messianics, we must think we're better because we got this that they don't got. No. It's about word and deed. You can say, like the Pharisees, that you are all you want. You can have this outward righteousness. Okay? But your deeds don't line up with that. Then it doesn't matter. You might as well be like Esau, who is the firstborn, but won't have the blessing or the birthright. So what was the point? And that's the same as religious people who want to say, oh, they're religious, or they follow God, or they're Messianic, or they're this and that. Look, title means nothing to me. I'm not a respecter of persons. God isn't a respecter of persons. So you don't have to tell me what you are, what group you are, or dress up, or put a tallit on, or shout an oiveh at me, or a havarim, or do a Davidic dance. I don't care about any of that stuff. It doesn't mean anything to me. That's just outward stuff. That's just Esau. Right? Doesn't matter though. It's the inward man. That's the one that's ultimately going to sustain the blessing. So next we go to the strong spirit overcomes the strong flesh. So now we get Yaakov goes through all this stuff. He offers gifts even to Esau, right? And that's fruit, right? Number one is repentance, because he's bringing forth, as Yohanan said, John the Baptist, bring forth fruit worthy of repentance. That's what Yaakov isn't coming empty-handed. He's sending before him his gifts. And this is a model of righteousness. Actually having righteousness. Not, again, going back to word and deed. And this battle isn't about what you say, it's about what you do and say. Is that in alignment? Do you have the fruit? Are you a tree that bears fruit, or you don't got the fruit? You're just a tree. What is the point of a tree that doesn't bear fruit? Right? As it says, it's good for nothing to be cast down and burned. Okay? So when we get to this gifts that come back, this is what's required just to survive. That's literally part of the element that's going to save Yaakov's life. And if he didn't have it, maybe things would have been different. Because you don't come out with 400 men to meet somebody just to hug it out with them and then take off. So those men are with a purpose. So here we have Yaakov, who is praying for help. He needs the strength of YHWH, the help of YHWH, to help him through this tough situation. Esau has the strength of the flesh. He's got all these men, this might, right? And Yaakov prays to God. He's got his strength because he's counting in God. So as he humbles himself in the flesh, he strengthens himself by having God's help. And this is what a spiritual man does. And what ultimately wins in this situation, when they're rejoined together, the strong spirit, even though he was weaker in the flesh, he didn't have as many men, armed men, or anything like that, to just say, hey, I got 5,000 armed men, you come out with 400, we crush you. I don't care if you like me coming back or not. Boom, make you my slave. It could have gone that way. But that's not what we're seeing. And so what we see is that the one with the Spirit, with God, who's praying to God, is going to prevail. Not the one who necessarily had the earthly strength. And so we see this with this whole concept, and it reminded me of the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes basically take us through this concept that, the blessed are they, right? When you're reviled and persecuted, and they say all manner of evil against you, right? So did they, the prophets before you, right? You're blessed when the earth is coming, or the flesh is coming against you, the wicked ones, right? The world, right? Because the whole point of the Beatitudes is that those people who did what was right, those people who loved God, right? If you look through all of those, I'll probably do another video all on that. In comparison to the world, that's this Esau Yaakov moment, and this reuniting, this fearful bringing together of the flesh and the spirit. The sides are chosen. They've been separated, and there's a difference between them, And now they're going to come back together, and what's going to happen and who's going to prevail. And we get that with the Beatitudes. Next we cover wrestling with the angel. So we got this little weird interlude where he wrestles with an angel or messenger that night before he goes over, and won. So he sends a servant. He divides up his camp. He's praying to be delivered, and he sends out his gift. And notice he didn't just kick back and say, "Oh, God help me," and not send over his gift. See, he's responsible, just as John said, Yohanan, to bring fruit worthy of repentance. You don't just say, "I'm sorry." God will cover it. He just loves me. He'll cover everything and all that. You have a requirement and a payment made, and your part. And so all these things, and then just in the same way, this is the model of repentance as well. In the same way, there's that fear, right, of the judgment. A lot of people don't have that. A lot of religious people don't. They go, "Oh no, because my faith, I believe, and I believe I'm going to get good things. And Jesus died for our sins." They've got their sales pitch and all this and that. And so, I'm going to boldly go to the throne. And they have no guilt and no fear. You see, Yaakov, even though he sent his gifts, even though he divided up his bands and trying to do everything he can and praying and counting on God, he's still afraid. And most people say, "Oh, well, he shouldn't be afraid. He's got God. Mighty. He's going to be a shield." But he has fear. Because you're supposed to. Because you did wrong. And even though you do everything you should to make it right, you should still be afraid and fear for the sins and for the things that you've done wrong. That fear shouldn't leave you. That fear should be why you don't want to sin again. And it's part of that repentance package. So when we see this now, next we have this wrestling, and what do we have? Now we have a new model where Yaakov, who is going to get his name changed, the promise of his name changed to Yisrael, same person, but this is talking about, a lot of times I look at that as physical Yaakov versus spiritual Yaakov when he's called Yisrael. And in the same way, Israel is also physical or literal Yisrael, and then I believe there's a spiritual Yisrael as well. Not everybody who's physically part of Israel is spiritually Israel. That goes back into the wheat and the tares and all of that. So you see all these patterns overlaying here, and we see that Yaakov now is going to wrestle with the angel. So we see again a flesh versus spirit, in my opinion, situation in the sense of heavenly. It could have been an earthly messenger. There's a lot of different theories, though I tend to think it is probably an angel or messenger. And there's a whole bunch of interesting things to go into that. But the thing is that he wrestled, right? So this is just like the Torah. Some people think it's Mashiach that he's wrestling. And in that sense, it'd still be the Torah. And this is ultimately the wrestling, like I said, that we're going on with ourselves. See, Yaakov's constantly striving with Esau. And yet Yaakov put on Esau's clothes and became Esau on the outside, but he's Yaakov on the inside. And ultimately, he will be fully blessed. That's what he did to get the blessing. But eventually he's going to shed that outer Esau, and he's going to be blessed and fully prevail as just Yaakov, the spiritual man. And that becomes a model also of circumcision, of taking off that flesh, that foreskin, that Esau, that outer covering, and this ties into the covenant. So when you see this, we get to this concept of wrestling with the angel and how the spirit prevails. He says he changes his name to Yisrael because he prevails with Elohim and man. So now again we get that contrast of the spirit and flesh. So Yaakov is overcome, right? Because what happened? His joint got put out, right? Here's a fleshly wound. And yet he didn't give up. Now when your flesh is no longer working, right? If he was just fleshly, he would have quit. But what keeps him going is that spiritual side. His spirit won't let him quit, even though his flesh is failing. And so this illustrates again how, because he wasn't only fleshly, then when he's wounded in the flesh, it isn't a wound that can stop him, because if his spirit and his determination is to win, and he wouldn't let him go, and this is all another illustration of how the spirit is greater than the flesh, because his flesh was weak, but his spirit was strong. And because of that, he prevailed both with God, with the spirit, and with men, the flesh. It illustrates that the spirit is greater than the flesh. And this goes into this concept of the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and it goes into all of these other patterns and models as well. It goes into Mashiach versus Moshe, and it goes Mashiach versus Yohanan, John the Baptist, and how one is greater than the other. It doesn't diminish. One wasn't destroyed by the other, but one becomes greater, and it's that spirit that is clearly always shown as greater. And what you can see as well, as it said, if the outwardness is wickedness, then how great could that wickedness be that then causes that outward wickedness on the inside? If the spirit is greater, then your outward wickedness isn't even the worst part, right? You see someone's outward wickedness, it's their inward wickedness that is really much greater, because that's the spiritual wickedness, and that's what's the really sad and evil thing. And people don't want to admit it because they want to pretend like they're right with God and spiritually good, even though they're outwardly doing wickedness. Then you're not. You're blind to your own spirit and the wickedness in your own heart. As it says, a man's heart is wicked, who can know it? And so we see this concept of wrestling with the angel, and he prevails, and he gets this new name, new authority. And next we go into the next section, which is that he meets with Esav, and he's preserved, right? He didn't die. He wasn't overran by Esav. The spirit was preserved. Yaakov, the spiritual man who prayed and relied on God, who's spiritual, he ultimately prevails. And even the name, that he will prevail with men, is almost a foreshadow that he will be okay when it comes to dealing with Esav, who represents the flesh or man. And in a way, by his name being changed to Israel, it's already being told that he will prevail with Esav as well. So he divided his camp. You see, because he's a spiritual man, he wants to protect a remnant, his wife and children, right? And I actually, in one of the things, just so everybody knows, by the way, like on my Twitter account and stuff like that, I share different Messianic videos and articles and a whole variety of stuff. I'm not necessarily sharing those because I endorse them, because I don't endorse anybody's stuff 100%. I don't go, wow, that person has it right, and I agree with them on every point, and that's why I'm sharing it. I expect that you have your own brain, and I share stuff on there. You know, I had a post on there. I share all kinds of stuff. I share stuff from FFOZ, even though I disagree with many things that they say. So I might share a post that says, hey, something about Hanukkah, and it might be a pro-Hanukkah thing, but I might share something else that challenges whether or not a person should observe Hanukkah. Because unlike a lot of people out there who feel like the only thing they should promote is their view, and that they should shelter everybody, because as if people were so dumb that they couldn't make up their own mind, I believe much differently, especially even on our new website. You know, I want to present the different sides. I'll have my personal commentary on the topics as I do topical videos, and I may do even videos on particular articles or videos that other people have done critiquing it. But I just want everybody to know that. So if you see something that says, hey, Hanukkah's great, here's 3 reasons you should celebrate it. If it's on my feed, my Messianic feed, like on Twitter, most of that, there's not a lot of Messianic stuff on Twitter, so I try and be a resource for a variety of content pulled from various people, which there's not, again, a lot, and I like people to be able to hear many different perspectives so that they can make up their own mind and use their own brain and think about it and ascertain their judgment. So just wanted to say that. But this concept of protecting the remnant, right? Going back to the spirit preserved, is that if we're looking at the way Yaakov operated, one of the things, the reason why I brought that other thing up is because, like, I have the parashahs in 60 seconds that I have on our website. And it's great for a quick little 60-second, here's the stuff. I don't agree with all the stuff that they said. Like in this week's parashah, the parashah in 60 seconds said that, and I believe he was inaccurate in saying that Yaakov went behind them. I think he misread maybe, or quickly read or misread Genesis 33:2, where it says, and he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rahel and Yosef hindmost. Okay? He probably read that the handmaids were in the front, and so he's picturing himself. Then it says he passed over, right? And he's picturing himself going behind them. In other words, as if he put his family and all of the people up there in case it was going to be battled. Because in the video, the parashah 60-second video, it's telling, and he goes, oh, he did put all these in droves and blah, 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 and he went in the back, and then it says coward. And then it flashes over to the next point. First of all, I wouldn't lightly call somebody like Yaakov or anybody in the Bible a name. There's no need to. Calling someone as important as Yaakov, Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, I mean, I'm pretty sure they have a very key role in relationship with God, enough that they're written in, and he ultimately is the father of Israel. So people sometimes say things just off the cuff, oh yeah, Moshe this, or Avram didn't do that, or Kepha did that, and it's like, that's a hand-selected disciple of Mashiach. I don't see your name being written of in there, and so important that you're doing this. So to run around and start criticizing or name calling, like, you can say, well, I think this, I'm sorry that Moshe struck the rock. I'm not running around going, oh, Moshe, how stupid, I can't believe he did that, like I wouldn't have done that. I mean, people do that all the time, and it just kind of, like, it takes me back to what it says. Miriam and Aharon, you're talking about the high priest of Israel, right? One of the holiest people in here selected. And YHWH says, why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moshe? Right? Why weren't you afraid to even say a word against my servant? So just a little warning out there for people, about what they're saying. You can say, well, I think this, or, I don't know why he went back there, or, it didn't seem like the right thing to do. But don't be bold and assume you know. And in this case, I believe he was wrong, because in verse 3 it says, and he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brethren, or to his brother. So I believe that he was in front, not in the back. And I think that this makes sense when it says Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, kissed him and wept, and then lifted up his eyes and saw the women. Well, if the women and all that were first, you wouldn't lift up your eyes. He would have already seen them, and then he just asked who it was. But if they were behind him, and then he hugs him and kisses him and says, oh, and lifts up his eyes from Yaakov, right? He would then see the people behind Yaakov. And this makes more sense, because it even says, and saw the women and children and said, who are these with you? And he said, these are the children Elohim's graciously given your servant. And it says, then the handmaids came near, which also denotes that they weren't near. So if he met them first, they wouldn't have to come near. They would already be near, because it would be Yaakov who was then coming near, and their children, and they bowed themselves. And then it also says, and Leah with her children then came near. So actually the handmaids first then come near, then that. And if you're looking at it from a linear fashion, if Yaakov first met Esau and was out front, then the handmaids came near, then Leah, that's all logical. But people glance over stuff to the point that they're calling Yaakov a coward. First of all, just a bad idea. Second, I don't think it's even showing that you were diligent enough in reading the text there and seeing what was the actual order. So we've got to be careful. Yaakov actually, in this case, did the opposite. Wasn't a coward who was hiding behind women and children. He went up first, which would have been the first to kill, so that hopefully they would be behind him and could get away. So quite a different picture from just reading the text accurately. So next we get into the concept of the hug. So we've got the hug, okay? So they hug it out, and this is what I call the return of the spirit in the flesh. Because this moment of trouble, this moment where originally this started, if you think back to him actually putting on the clothes of Yaakov, this was essentially the first hug, so to speak, where Yaakov was covered and embraced by Esau. He was embraced by his clothes. He was covered with all these things that were like having literally Esau on him, and when he was going in to get the blessing from his father. And so now we see that situation, that pattern come again. Now Esau, Yaakov being a spiritual man, is once again covered with Esau, but things have changed and he's gone through some stuff. And now this isn't this is not just about being covered with Esau, but then when Esau is removed, literally the next section where he wants to go with him and then he says, no, you go ahead. That's a removal of Esau, and which is also a model of circumcision. And then what you have left over is Yaakov, who's finally able to come back home and be blessed. So this is the fulfillment really of this blessing and this whole situation, because he counted on God. And so when the two come together, right, this very important moment where instead of Esau trying to kill Yaakov, Esau embraces Yaakov, and this is again peace for Yaakov. And this is the model, this hug, of the spirit and the flesh being one, and the spirit and the flesh being ihad and in unity, and no longer in war. And so when this happens, right, it's just like this whole thing fits into the microcosm, the mini universe pattern of when Mashiach says this already. He says, clean the inside of the cup that the outside of the cup may be clean. So this is what happened. Yaakov is the inside of the cup. He's the spiritual man. When he's right with God, it's not going to be his destruction. It's not going to be you clean the inside of the cup, therefore the outside of the cup is going to be filthy, right? It's if you clean the inside of the cup, then the outside of the cup will be cleaned. And so when you focus spiritually first, then what happens is he was spiritually relying on God. As a result, the union of Yaakov with him didn't lead to death, it led to life. And so literally, if the inside was, if Yaakov was clean and had God, then Esau coming to him wouldn't result in death. It would then also be acceptable, and the result of that would be life, the continued life of Yaakov. So next we get to the concept of traveling alone, and this is this concept of removing, I already said, removing the flesh. And now the blessing is with Yaakov, not because he's clothed with, if that was the promise of the blessing, right? Because if you remember, Yitzhak said, and truly he will be blessed, right? So what happens is, now Esau is hugged him and then is removed and going out from him, and now this is really the point where Yaakov have made it through his troubles, and this is where he's really going to be blessed. And this takes us to this concept of, like I said, circumcision, of the removal of the flesh, and it also takes us this concept of Yaakov in the holy days, right? So he went through this very difficult time, and then the result is afterwards that he'll the time of joy and blessing. As a matter of fact, part of that is modeled when it says he's going to return to Yitzhak, which is means laughter, and it's a return to joy. And all of this has a sub-pattern, right, of the holy days, of the wheat harvest, actually, in particular. So you start off with the beginning of this parashah as he's sending the servants. So he's sending out a message to Esav representing the flesh or the world, right? That's the model of Yom Teruah, in my opinion, where it's a message and a warning, right? It's a message to the world and a warning. It's saying Mashiach is coming, right? In this case, represented by the spiritual Yaakov, the spirit of truth of Torah, and to the world. So Yisrael saying to the world, right? So like we said, the signs of the Spirit. That's Yom Teruah. It's this. It's both a warning and a message that overall is encompassed in this next period, which is a period of fear between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur, and repentance. This is that fear where we're trying to make it right. This would be the time when Yaakov is sending out the gifts, when Yaakov is praying, and when Yaakov is afraid and dividing up and getting his house in order, so to speak. This is this model. And then the meeting of Esav and Yaakov is like Yom Teruah, which is this time of judgment, because he literally says, it is like as if I had saw God and lived. So we even get that little hint that this is a model of the judgment, of seeing the face of God, which is the face in the Ramez, or spiritual definitions, is a model of judgment. So all these things are there. And then afterwards, when everything's okay, and he gets past that very difficult time, is this time, right, where he is now joyful. This is a time of blessing, which is the model of Sukkot, which is interesting because the next thing in this week's parashah that he does is Yaakov goes to Sukkot, the place called Sukkot, right? And that's not a coincidence. And built a house and an altar there, calling it El Elohi Israel. So that's this is essentially telling us this is the pattern of the wheat harvest, okay? And there's a lot of things. I'm not going to go into them because we're already 57 minutes deep here on this, maybe in another video, but there's a lot there worthy of being talked about. So next thing we get to is Shechem's desire, I call it. And here we have Shechem, the prince who's going to take Dinah, the daughter of Yisrael. Dinah in Hebrew means justice, and he's going to rape her. And this is also a model of the raping of justice. Well, what is the raping of justice? And what is this when somebody who's not from Israel joins themselves to Israel and becomes one with Israel, though they're not really part of Israel? You see, so many people look at this from that's the bad guys, they're the pagans, they're the outsiders, and then there's Israel. But I look at it a little differently. What I see is the model of religion, of man-made religion. They're like Shechem, who've joined themselves to Israel and to God when they're not exactly, even though they become one with it in the flesh, they don't really belong. Because Israel, truly Israel, is truth and justice, just as Dinah's name means. And that's what the truth is. But there's many people who will say, well, I'm Messianic. Oh yeah. Well, they're joining themselves to the Torah. That's the thing that's good and pure. They aren't. And a lot of times their interpretations and the way they do it and the way they live becomes this defilement of the world defiling, mixing with something that's true. So they're running around saying, well, I'm Messianic, I'm Torah observant, and then you see some of the choices they make, and they're doing all kinds of things that are against the Torah, right? And yet they're going around presenting it, right? They're not even ashamed. They actually Just like Shechem wanted to keep Dinah. He rapes her, and then instead of like, okay, we're going to go to battle over this, he doesn't have any remorse about raping her. He wants to keep her then and take her and keep her permanently, even though he took her by force. And he wants approval of Israel. In many ways, just like religious people want the approval of God, even though they've taken His Torah and taken His things and adulterated it and raped it and defiled it. And then yet they want to continue to do the holy days, even though they're doing things they shouldn't be doing. You know? I personally don't believe in cooking on the Sabbath, based on the explicit verse that it says not to. There's a lot of Messianic congregations who go out there. What have they got? They got the oven going. They got the crock pots. Oh, well, we're not baking it. We're reheating it because we baked it once. So this is a second baking. So technically we'll rename it and call it reheating. And that all of a sudden is, even if they acknowledge the fact that you shouldn't bake, they're going to reclassify it out of being a sin because this is I got to look at the nozzle. What's the nozzle you're turning on there? Does it say reheat or does it say bake? Like, it's obvious. Nowhere does it say, unless you've pre-baked it before, then you can bake and boil on the Sabbath all you want. It says, don't bake and boil on the Sabbath. Bake and boil what you will the day before and carry it over. This is easy. But it's again the lustly desires, just like Esau, over food. A lot of sins happen around food. Because it's just a momentary pleasure and desire, but you're willing to throw away obedience to God over something that's a momentary fix. So I go to a congregation, I see up there, they got cookies baking in the oven, they've got stuff on the crock pot on simmer, they've got all this stuff. And I'm like, they got hot coffee, which is boiling hot, literally, they're boiling and baking. And yet they're out there, you know, oy veyes, you know, we're doing Davidic dance, we're saying, 50 Hebrew prayers and doing all this. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? You're raping the Torah. You're defiling it. Why are you trying to focus so much on presenting yourself and wanting to hold on to the things of Torah, hold on to Dinah where it serves you, right? But you're defiling it at another point, and you think you're going to hold on to it. And this is a pattern in the structure. No one wants to think they're the bad guy. Everybody thinks they're the good guy, everybody else must be the bad guy. You better get your picture right and get your model right. Take an honest look, just like the Pharisees. Are we blind, right? They thought they were the good guys. They're going to get the reward, pat on the back. Everybody else must be the bad guys. He's going to, Messiah's going to come. He's going to look at the Roman and be like, hey, those Romans are wicked. And he's going to look at those Pharisees and say, wow, look, you were just doing a good job. Thank you. We want to give you extra blessings and rewards. That's not what happened. As a matter of fact, the Roman who believed in Mashiach, his son was healed. And I think he was more honorable than many of the Pharisees who were there wearing all these tzitzis and garbs and talits and, oh, we have the Torah and we study this and we do this and we got all this show. But they were raping Dinah. They were raping justice. They weren't doing what was right. And so we see that this desire, their desire, are not right desires. Many people sitting in front of the room, up front, preacher. I'm a preacher. I haven't met too many preachers that I found that I thought, wow, this person's real desire is to do right and all that. I see a lot of, that's what's portrayed. And, oh, look at me. Look at me, how I'm dedicating my life to God and I'm doing all this. They like to stand up in front of the room. They like to be self-justified and feel like they're good because they're the one that everyone respects or everyone's giving them honor, the honor of men, just like the Pharisees. It's no different. Why are they're doing all the Torah. They can brag about how many bowing prayers they do in Hebrew and all this and that. Where do we get the Messiah giving them a high five or saying, oh, that's awesome, you're praying like 4 times a day and you're doing all that? We don't get that in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, we get the opposite. We get the story of the publican right? And the guy who comes in is like, look at how many times I'm fasting, and look at what I give all my tithe, and he probably does all those things. Did Messiah say, well, then you're pretty awesome? He didn't count those things. He didn't add value and show the value in those things. He diminished the value of those things and showed the value in the publican who was truly repentant, who had the right spirit, even though all the other things. And that same pattern is the pattern of the Pharisees. So, to me, I just look over and over again and I see the same patterns, and people are like, oh yeah, well, this is Messianic Rabbi so-and-so. I don't care. I could sit down and talk with him for 5 minutes. His title doesn't mean anything. I could talk to someone who goes to his congregation, who I see striving harder to search for the truth and who's more humble. And to me, that person is doing better than the guy in front of the room, who's getting, like Shechem, he's just satisfying his own desires. Did Shechem really want Dinah? Did he say, and do it the honorable way, and say, well, I'd love to join to you and I'm willing to take on the Torah and be as you are, if that means that I can marry? That'd be the honorable way. And it literally says that Shechem was more honorable than all of those others in his kingdom, right? And he's the rapist. And that's the most honorable, which is in reflexive thought saying the other people are not honorable at all. Right? So you look at people who are in the religious world and organizations, and I see all kinds of people, and some of the ones who are exalted and lifted up don't seem very honorable to me. It's a fake piety and fake humility, and you get to talking with them and you talk about the Torah and you talk about this and that, and it's not about head knowledge, it's not about this, and it's not about, you can cut through all that, So what happens is they go and tell him, you have to be as us. And the story of Dinah is just a weird thing. I'm not going to get too deep into it now based on time, but people have different opinions about it, whether it was right or wrong to kill them or have them be circumcised or all this. Even in the text itself, Yaakov and his sons essentially are arguing over whether or not it was right. And they're the people in the Bible, let alone the people who are reading about it. But one thing that I see there is, it says, you must be as us. Now, some people think, well, that's just fleshly, right? If you're fleshly, they're just getting circumcised in the flesh. But that wasn't just what circumcision was about. It was a sign of the covenant. And to join Israel, to literally be as them, there's one law, as it says, for the stranger, and one law for, is the same law for the one who's homeborn. So to really be like them, they have to accept the Torah. Now in the Torah, if the man rapes a woman in the field, he's put to death, because it says that whether she cries out or not, she would be in the open field and nobody would hear her. The man was put to death. So Shechem, according to Torah, deserved to die. Okay? So he was put to death. Then you go, well, what about all the other people? Why would they all be there? Well, I think in the pattern, what's happening is if they're all less honorable than Shechem, and Shechem raped Dinah, which is the model of raping justice, and he was the ruler over all of them, then they probably would have done the same or worse. It's a measure of their judgment. And in that nature, also they represent, again, the flesh versus the spirit. Israel represents the spirit. The flesh is going to be what? Just like I said, the model of circumcision is going to be removed. That the glory of the spiritual man be revealed. The flesh will be removed. Right? So when we look at this, this is exactly what's happening here. They're the model, Shechem and his thing, in my opinion, of religion, which joined to falsely and in a defiling way to God. And ultimately, just like the tares as well, they're going to be removed. And that's what happens here. And it happens even as they try and, as they go through the process of being circumcised, but they're not honorable and they're not keeping the Torah. What will happen to those people who try and join Israel, who are not honorable and do not keep the Torah? I believe they'll be removed. And I think that's the parable the lesson that we're learning from this story, at least one of them. Because the justice, Dina, the judgment, right? That's what this is about. You're not going to join to God and retain your old wicked judgment. It isn't going to happen. It's just like it says in the New Testament. Don't think that the adulterers and the whoremongers and all this and that are going to be in the kingdom. They're not. And so if you think that, hey, well, I just got this salvation thing, or I just got, whatever, I'm a Jew, I'm a chosen person, or, that's going to make me cool with God and be able to live with God, or, hey, because I'm a Christian, I'm saved, I'm good with God, or, hey, because I'm Messianic and I got, both sides. No. You better have justice. You better have not defiled justice. You better have not raped Dina. Okay? You better be right and pure and obey. So we see the next thing in this week's parasha. They're told to put away the idols. So after this, we see that that Yaakov tells the people, because he's told to go back to Beit El, which is also the house of God. Go back to the house of God. So this is also an interesting thing here. And Yaakov tells them to put away idols and be clean. Idols represent things that are earthly, right? There's no spirit in an idol. So we have the same pattern of the spirit versus the flesh, spiritual versus the earthly. Put away things that lack the spirit. Take off that Asaph. Be circumcised. We're going to the house of God, right? That's what this is. These patterns are all saying in the different levels of understanding. Then we get to this concept of on the way to Ephrat, Rachel has hard birth and dies giving birth to Benjamin. And you say, well, what could this mean? And some of this is, in my opinion, this concept of Ephraim. And I think there's a pattern here. There's many patterns always. But one of the patterns that I see here is Rachel representing Ephraim. And this whole concept of what Ephraim's going to go through, because from her, right, you look at Yosef lived and had his mother. And then Benjamin comes and we see this situation where new life is created, but then life is also lost in the process. And new life comes out of this death is one of the patterns that we see. And then the other pattern is that we see, then what does that mean? Is that Benjamin doesn't have a mother who's the provider and the comforter, right? And yet emerges into life, but doesn't have what Yosef had. Yosef had the mother, and Benjamin's not going to have Rachel to be there as he grows up and all of that. So there's a little bit of a thing. So it's almost Rachel, who I think represents, in this situation, Ephraim, has two sons, right? So one of them she is with, and one of them she's not with. And Rachel, in that sense, also models the Torah. So we see the pattern that in that situation, there's many kind of sub-patterns in the scriptures, or overlapping patterns. But we see the model with Yosef representing Ephraim, being the firstborn of Rachel, and Ephraim also started off with God and actually got the blessing, and the kingdom was given to them because Yehuda was committing idolatry. When you get into Hosea and that whole book, and you learn about what happened and the promise that God made to Ephraim to give him the kingdom, and then they went into idolatry, but they were getting the kingdom and it was being taken away from Yehuda because they were doing idolatry. So then when he gives it to Ephraim, and then Ephraim goes into idolatry, that's when they get the curse of Lo Ami, not my people, and Lo Ruhama, no mercy, and they get scattered among the nations. So all of that's relevant to this part, because what's going to happen in this pattern, this just small pattern here, is that Benjamin is like that son of the right hand, which is who he's ultimately going to be. And I'm not going to dig into all these details to give you the backstory of why I believe these things mean these things, because it's a longer thing that I would have to explain. But Benjamin means son of the right hand. And the right hand generally represents the spirit of love for God. And Mashiach, I believe, is represented by the outstretched, being the firstborn on the right hand. And being the love of God, the strength of love of God. That was his strength. Not my will, but thy will, right? And so Ephraim is also going to come back that way. So when they come from being lo ami, they didn't have the Torah, they lost their holy days and their new moons, but the return of the love for God is going to bring them back to the Torah. And they're going to have the right spirit when they reapproach it. And that's also going to cause jealousy among the Jews who have the Torah. But now you have these people who don't necessarily know that they're Jewish or don't need to be. They just want to come back and do what's right and love God and follow the Torah. And then there's going to be a provocation there. And that gets into kind of the reuniting of Ephraim and Yehudah. But the point is that this contrast of Rachel dying as she's giving birth to Benjamin shows this. You put all these observations and pieces together and you see that it's Ephraim who, for a time when they're gone, is like that represents the lack of their mother, which is the Torah, during that time when they're scattered. And yet they're going to go on and live from this death. So it takes us back to the parable of the prodigal son. And my son who is dead now lives, same thing. That's tied in my opinion, to Rachel dying at the birth of Benjamin, and Joseph representing, the life, of Ephraim, who's right with God. And then there's a time they no longer have the Torah, but then they're going to come out, and there's be this blessing, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. But it's very interesting. So many people glance straight through this stuff. They don't take, oh, okay, she dies, he's born. They don't think about anything. They're gulping milk. Just going in, one gulp, it's gone, instead of having teeth to chew and to break it down and to think about it and meditate on it. So next we get that, the Haftorah, where it literally says that though Ephraim and Yehudah were wicked, he'll bring Ephraim back, and Israel shall fear him. So this is this same thing. Actually, at the end of the Parashat, Yaakov comes to Yitzhak, and this is this joy. That joy is also the model of Sukkot, which we already got in the middle of this Parashat, and then in the sub-patterns of the holy days with Yaakov. So these patterns repeat about 3 different ways all throughout this, on small levels and sentences, and then in overall arching pieces that we see with what's going on. So this whole parasha to me really reflects this concept of the spirit versus the flesh. And this is the story of how the spirit will rule and will reign. This is a story of Mashiach, how he will reign even over, you could apply that to the letter of the law, that the spirit of the law, which doesn't diminish the letter of the law, actually the only way it diminishes it is simply by being greater than it. It becomes a small part of it, of the greater spirit. So just because you no longer look on a woman with lust, obviously you're not going to physically sleep with another man's wife and commit adultery. The actual act doesn't disappear, or the command not to do the act. It's magnified by the spirit of the law. And in comparison, the spirit of the law is much greater than that one example of saying just don't do this, physically do this with another man. Now Mashiach opens up the Torah as it's prophesied that he will, and magnifies it, makes it even greater, and he, in comparison to what you had in the flesh, the literal, is much greater, his spiritual teachings. So it's the same thing here. There's a lot of people who talk about, being spirit-led, and, I don't think, it's so many people say, I don't know. They think you have the spirit when they agree with you. And then the minute you say something that doesn't sit right with their spirit, then they, he doesn't have the Holy Spirit leading him and all of that, which then means that they must be the Holy Spirit, because whatever spirit they have sets the standard. Many of these people who talk all about having the Holy Spirit, criticize people for being wrong or they're a false teacher or this and that. The things they believe are just wackadoo. They're all over the board, easily disprovable of it lining up with the Torah, and their judgment's wrong. So it's like, this is the same thing that we see this. When you really talk about being spirit-led, then you're going to have judgment. You're going to have discernment. You're going to rightly separate things. You're going to study the Torah, and you're not going to be a raper of the Torah or a defiler of the Torah. You're going to be somebody who tries to keep it as clean and pure, and realize that you're likely the defilement, and that you're approaching unto the purity of the Torah is problematic in itself, and that you'll be fearful and tread carefully with the great thing that comes from God. And so I hope you enjoyed my message, Spirit versus the Flesh, and I hope you saw some new things. Hit subscribe. We're going to have a 10-minute summary version of this video that I'm doing for my videos, so that people who don't want to spend the time to get in depth with me on the full message can get the little summary and still get some. It's easy to share the summary. If they like the summary, there's the link to the full message. Make sure that you leave a comment on my videos when I post them, because most of the social platforms will slowly make people's posts disappear from your feeds unless you're commenting on them. So a smiley face, a thumbs up, a hey, whatever it is, leave a comment and like them, and that way we can make sure we're still connected. I appreciate it. Until next time, I'm going to say shalom.